Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. And you are joining us at a great time because we are live right now in a brand new trial here on the network. The Eric Boyd case out of Tennessee. Opening statements have begun. The prosecution is currently delivering their opening statement and outlining their case against this man, who they say is really ultimately much more responsible for the deaths of Shannon Christian and her boyfriend Christopher Newsom than we previously thought. Originally, he was charged with just federal crimes, mostly accessory after the fact for being implicated in their deaths. 4 other people were ultimately convicted for what happened to these two. But now the prosecution believes they have more evidence to suggest that he was directly involved in what happened to them. He is charged with murder, kidnapping, rape, and a plethora of charges. So we're going to go live right now. She is going into how these two were ultimately kidnapped back on January 6, 2007 after leaving a party. Let's go back live. Okay, so as the prosecution delivers their opening statement, we're getting more of an idea of what happened to these two young people as they were abducted heading out to a friend's birthday party. But I want to understand exactly how we should break all this down. So joining me first is criminal defense attorney Sarah Becker. Sarah, what have you heard so far that has been tied directly to Eric Boyd, the defendant? Have you heard anything yet, or are we waiting to hear it?
I think we're still waiting to hear what his direct connection is. And, I'm hoping she gets to it fairly soon. I know that opening should be used to draw a roadmap for the jury and kind of give them an idea of what the testimony to come is going to be. But my fear here is that she's going into too much minute detail about everything that led up to the defendant's connection without really emphasizing why he's the one sitting at that table here today.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also from our end, it's a little difficult to hear her. As Joseph Scott Morgan mentioned earlier, the pacing might be an issue as well. Right. She is getting a lot into the details, and it's kind of hard to understand the overall story here. Joseph, I want to go to you. And again, we have with us here on set Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. She just went into what it was like to discover the body of Mr. Newsom, and that was quite a sight. What do you make of this?
Yeah, it was. She talks about how the operator of the train actually saw the body in the middle of the train tracks. It had been set on fire. I think at first they thought that it was potentially a log, and when they approached it, they determined that it was in fact human. But there's so much evidence here, Jesse, and so many things to unpack from an evidentiary standpoint that it is important to get kind of a general overall picture. You're going to have plenty of time downrange to go into the minutia of this case, but I want to be compelled. I want to be drawn in relative to the narrative of the story. This jury has not heard this story before. This thing has been tried multiple times. We need to keep the memory of these victims alive and tell their story through the narrative. That alone is going to bring us to the point where we can understand the entire collective of what's being put forward.
Yeah, that's well said. I mean, we are learning more details of this, and it is quite disturbing. As Joseph said, they discovered the body of Mr. Newsom, and he was tied up, he was gagged, he was wrapped in a fabric, it was set on fire, he was shot in multiple places, and he had also been indicated that he had been raped. Horrible, horrible scene. We're going to take a break on our end. When we come back, we're going live. Stay tuned. Okay, well, Sarah, after they go into really just a horrible accounting of what happened to these two victims, now we're starting to understand how Eric Boyd's role was in this case. And I guess the question is, why did it take so long for them to ultimately charge him with these state charges? Again, he was charged federally with, accessory after the fact and another charge. But the issue now is he's facing state charges for murder and kidnapping and rape. Why? What was the change here?
Well, it seems that the change is that they are now able to use statements from that now convicted cohort, right? We heard her talk about the issues that can come to be legally when you have statements of co-defendants who are being tried together at the same time. I'm not certain that I fully grasped why it took so long for it to happen. That could be maybe a matter of them working with this co-defendant. Maybe he wasn't cooperative at the time, negotiating a deal with him to get that testimony and be able to present it at the trial of this defendant. That's something that will remain to be seen, I think, as the case develops, as the trial continues.
So let me ask you this, Joseph. The defense has just begun their opening statement. The prosecution just finished. Did you see any holes for the defense to jump in and say, well, maybe the evidence won't link to Mr. Boyd? There's a lot of factors, a lot of moving parts. Did you see anything for the defense to jump in there?
It was kind of hard to cut through the narrative for me. I'm a bit at a loss relative to what might be there. However, I think one of the biggest impacts of this moving forward is time. These guys have had time to sit in their cells and think about this, think about the time that they have been convicted. I think that one of these guys has probably rolled over, and the state has decided to move forward with charges relative to this.
Okay, well, we're going to have to see. Let's take a break. When we jump back, hopefully we'll be live with the defense's opening statement. Stay tuned. Sara, that was an interesting opening and a powerful one, to say the least, saying the evidence really doesn't link up to their client and that the prosecution just basically reprinted the indictment that they had against the 4 other individuals. And what do they have really new except the testimony of one of the convicted murderers to say, oh, Eric Boyd was involved? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think he nailed it with that opening, Jesse. It was in stark contrast to the prosecutor's opening. I think it was well organized. It was direct, it was short and to the point, and it emphasized the best piece of evidence that they had, that they did not find DNA, or lack of evidence, I guess is what it really is. There was no DNA from his client at the scene, and the state is relying on the word of a convicted felon who has a lot to gain by saying what the state wants him to.
What do you make of this? If they gave him a deal, this guy who's going to testify against him, 50 years at 85%, he has to serve 85% of that sentence at the very least, for what this guy was convicted of. We just heard what happened to these 2 young people. Have you ever heard of a deal like that?
Well, yeah, I think that it's hard, right? And I think the question, if I were the victim's family, is it worth that sort of deal for a man who was clearly present and intimately involved in the crime, just to tack something else onto an additional defendant? I think it's a questionable prosecutorial decision for sure, and maybe an indication that prosecution just went too far in their quest to want to get everyone who they felt was involved in the case, regardless of the strength of the evidence that they had.
Well, listen, I get it. I mean, with such a horrific crime, and again, the details are so utterly disturbing, you want to have everyone who may have been responsible brought to justice. I get that, and I completely understand it. But if you believe what the defense just said, that the prosecution may have a weak case, I mean, the idea here is the state going to maybe rely so much on those graphic details and how disturbing this account was in order to cloud the judgment of the jury and say, look, we might not have the best case, the evidence might not support it, the DNA evidence might not support, but listen to how graphic this was. He obviously had a bigger role.
You know, I think that's exactly right. And I think the defense did a great job of tackling the violent nature of the crime head on in his opening, because that is the state's strategy, it seems. So you tackle it head on and you kind of do what he said. You said, you know what, certainly you want justice for these victims, but the state's already gotten that from the people who were convicted previously. Don't feel a need to transfer that over to this defendant, who the evidence just may not be there.
And as the defense attorney said, they didn't bring an indictment against him in 2007 for murder, rape, kidnapping. They didn't. He was charged and he was convicted of a federal crime, a lesser crime, and that's the sentence that he's serving currently. Okay, so as we start with the testimony, Joseph, I want to start with you with what the defense said right before this witness got on the stand. Right, we had one more witness, but the issue is they say the DNA evidence does not support the prosecution's case. What's your thought on that?
You know, nowadays, Jesse, everybody wants to hear about DNA, and it is the topic. It's the go-to because it's something that we can actually not qualify but quantify, put a number to, and people want this because it's concrete. And in this particular instance, they're making the argument that it's invalid. It's not going to apply, and I gotta tell you, this is going to resonate with the jury.
Oh yeah, I mean, especially after what could be argued a little disorganized, all over the place prosecution opening. The defense was very straightforward with what they did. But Sara, I want to come to you. Now the prosecution, the ball is in their court. This is their case. They have been waiting for this. What kind of witnesses do we need to see today to support their case? First person they've called is somebody that knew Shannon's very well. So you tell me.
Well, you know, they have to lay out the full story, right? They've got to go into the details of how the crime was committed, because this jury hasn't heard those facts, right? They have to decide that the crime was committed by this group of people and that this defendant was a part of what was done to these. So I think today we'll hear them lay out all the facts as we see, maybe a chronological story of how the victims were carjacked. It's going to be, we already see emotional testimony, I think, because we've got to remember these witnesses are having to relive this all over again. Facts that day.
And let's not forget there's an overlap here. I mean, 4 people have been convicted, and this is just another person that the prosecution is trying to hammer away against. Sara, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate your perspective. As always, you may have to jump back on soon to talk about this case and other ones. We're going to take a quick break on our end. When we come back, we're going to be live. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back.